Thank you so much, Emily, and also Cara and Michelle for this series of talks. This was a new day full of presentations from OSI, and really appreciate you all taking on this series, and in particular, Cheryl Grandinetti for coordinating all of the talks today. Let's go ahead and jump into the Q&A because we do have several questions in the queue. We'll start with Cara. So the first question for you, Cara, when sites are identified for an inspection, would the same inspectors conduct the inspections for all the sites?
Thanks, Kim. Thanks for that question. Yeah, I didn't really comment on that during the presentation, but usually not. And part of it is because OII is organized by geographic area. So there are investigators that are assigned to a particular geographic area. So if there were sites that were chosen in, say, Florida and California, that same investigator would not be able to do both of those inspections, usually. I mean, sometimes there can be you're locked into a particular date with an investigator. So it just depends on if the timing works out. But usually it's not the case. Where I've seen one investigator do multiple inspections for an application is probably more commonly with foreign investigations. Usually, for example, the same country. Say we have inspections, and the fact that it requires months to actually do that. Many times there can be a particular one investigator from OII, the foreign cadre, that would then actually do those particular investigations. So that was a great question. I thank you for that. And
Great, thank you, Cara. And I think we're having some challenges with your audio, so we'll move on to one of the other speakers while we try to troubleshoot that. Michelle, let me give you the next question. So you mentioned notifying the sponsor for a CI inspection. Would you recommend having the sponsor team on site at the time of the inspection? Sometimes sponsors want to be on site.
Thanks, Kim. That's actually a very insightful question, so I'm glad that was asked. So FDA does not have a position for or against having the sponsor on site. I know during my presentation, I had mentioned that the sponsor may help the clinical investigator, say, prepare for the inspection, but we typically actually do not see them at the site. However, to my knowledge, there's no specific prohibition against this. So if a sponsor really wants to be on site, I think they certainly may be able to do that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And one more for you while I have you. Who can participate in the opening/daily/closing discussion with the inspector? Is it restricted to the team that is delegated for that particular protocol?
That's a good question. I actually hadn't thought about that up until now. So we do not have any rules or policies about who can or cannot participate in either the opening meeting, the daily discussions, or the closeout meeting. We typically have seen that these meetings are reserved to the team that's for the protocol, all the protocols being inspected. But I've also seen staff from the research office participate in the opening and closing meetings, as well as some management officials from the site that are involved more on the business and operations side. So it really can be a mixture of anyone.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Emily, a couple questions for you on RRAs. Do you foresee RRAs becoming robust enough to be considered as an inspection, or will in-person inspections always be needed?
Thanks, Kim. That's a very good question. So what I try to convey in my talk is sort of that, we would like to have a lot of tools in our toolbox. And so, in my mind, it's not a matter of RRAs not being as robust as inspections and, therefore is an option to replace inspections. It's just about what tool is best suited for the oversight that's needed for a particular operation. So I do foresee that in-person on-site inspections will always be needed and always be a very important part of how CDER conducts oversight of clinical trials. But, RRAs are, certainly robust. And as we gain more experience with the best situations in which to deploy them, we will certainly do them. And obviously, the same outcomes and consequences flow from RRAs as do from inspections. So they should be considered as robust. Thank you.
So along those same lines, we have another question. Can there be RRA and inspections, I assume in-person inspections, conducted for a single trial? How is it determined which one will be done, or will they be, I guess, in complement to each other?
Sure, thanks for the question. So when, as Cara mentioned during her presentation, often there will be several investigations for a single trial, right? We may do a couple of clinical investigator inspections and a sponsor CRO inspection. And those, again, could be a mix of inspections and RRAs as appropriate, depending on the particular needs. So it's not like we say, okay, for this trial, we're going to do inspections, and this trial, we're going to do an RRA. We use those, risk-based factors, the other considerations that I described in my presentation about what would be the most appropriate for that operation in determining whether to do the RRA or an inspection. What we typically, what we don't do is an inspection sort of and an RRA at the same time. If we're doing an inspection, we're going to do an inspection. If we do an RRA, we're going to do an RRA for the same establishment. And so that's a little bit of a distinction when you're talking about the trial. Depends on how many operations are being planned, but it could be a mix if that were appropriate for the particular circumstances. So I hope that helps. Thanks, Kim.
Yeah, I'm going to stick with you for one more question because I think these are all related. Do the same investigators conduct RRAs as well as on-site inspections, or are they specialized in one area of the field? And then are they all in the United States, or does FDA have internationally based inspectors?
Okay, thanks, Kim. Good question. So yes, the same investigators who do inspections will also do RRAs. There's not sort of a dedicated RRA staff. And so, just like, and I'm sure that there are folks that have done more than others and have experience, but they share that experience. And we certainly don't have folks that just do RRAs. They're also doing inspections. The folks who do RAs could be located anywhere. We, as Cara mentioned, and I know her audio was cutting in and out a little bit, but we do have OII has a foreign cadre of investigators, and those are investigators who are based in the United States, but who solely conduct foreign inspections. So they have a lot of frequent flyer miles loaded up. We also do have some staff within country in a couple places throughout the world who are able to support inspections as well. And again, depending on the needs of a particular operation or oversight, any of those folks could be conducting an RRA as well. So thanks.
Thank you for that. Obviously, a lot to coordinate given the international nature of many of the trials. Cara, let's go back to you and test out your audio again here. So a question that we received from the audience: if you have data that is required prior to a research procedure, but it is entered after, is it acceptable if your research note includes documentation that the data were obtained prior to the procedure?
Thanks for that question. I know I'm not supposed to say, can you hear me now? But in this case, yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think it's always helpful whenever you have to clarify something in a contemporaneous way, like when it's happening, that you document anything that happens that might be different from a protocol. It may or may not be a protocol deviation, it depends. But any additional information that you have that can help to inform the issue is helpful. It's helpful for the sponsor, it's helpful for the monitor, and it's helpful for us. For the example that I shared, it still would have been problematic because I may have a note that said that the assessment was done prior to data entry, but I still don't know how that particular assessment or assessor could have retained all of that information on a very complicated endpoint to record 3 hours later without, a scrap of paper that they wrote it on. There's no source. So it just depends on what it is. But again, anything that you can do that can help to explain anything at the time it was occurring is always helpful. Thank you very much for that question.
Thank you. And one more for you. In your presentation, you described a case related to data integrity concerns. What kinds of issues regarding informed consent do you see during your clinical investigator inspections?
Great question. Thank you. Yeah, I will say that we do probably see more often data integrity concerns than we do informed consent issues, but we do on occasion see informed consent issues as well. They're not usually with regard to the process of informed consent. As you know, it is a continual process. You have the beginning and then you have, continuing throughout the process. In my experience, we've most commonly seen issues with late consenting, for example, of an amended consent form that may have had significant new information. For example, new safety information that could potentially change a participant's decision to participate. We recognize that it does take time for amended consent forms to be approved by the IRB, but there really should not be a more significant delay in reconsenting once a form has been approved. So we've seen that on occasion. Also, another issue that's come up is when there are study procedures that are optional. For example, there could be a sub-study where there are additional procedures and consent needs to be obtained for those additional procedures. Sometimes there can be a separate consent form for these optional procedures. Sometimes it's a separate line item in one particular consent form. But many times we're seeing that those procedures are actually performed on participants when consent was not provided. It was declined. So again, it's up to the clinical investigator and study coordinator to be able to track that sort of information. Who has provided for consent for what aspect of the study? And again, this mostly comes up when there are sub-studies for maybe additional imaging studies or blood samples for genetic testing, things of that nature, which many times are a separate consent form, but sometimes they're actually in the main consent form, which is a separate item, separate section that requires a signature. So having a really good tracking mechanism for that is really important. And that's just the organization at a site level. But we do see that from time to time as well. Thank you so much for that question.
Thank you. Michelle, a couple questions for you related to the 483. What if you disagree with the 483 and submit a response to state this? If the center doesn't agree with the site, can the CAPA be provided later? And then there were a couple related questions about appealing the 483 and how you go about doing that.
All right, thanks, Kim. Yes, I'm not surprised that these questions have come through. So unfortunately, you cannot, quote, appeal a 483 per se, but as mentioned during the presentation, you can certainly disagree with one or more of the 483 observations and submit your explanation, your rationale, and your documentation to support your position. So we recommend submitting your CAPA with your response so we can review everything together at the same time. And your CAPA can be written in such a way as to reflect your position. So if you disagree, write your CAPA in such a way that disagrees with the observation. However, I've also seen CAPAs where a clinical investigator will disagree with a specific observation, but then include additional language saying something like, yeah, well, but if the center disagrees with this position and ultimately, stands by what they put on the 483, here's what our CAP is going to be instead. So they actually provide a scenario, for both situations. Thanks, Kim.
Thank you. And one more for you. We heard it's highly encouraged to respond in writing to observations noted on the Form 483, but this is done after the inspection ends. If a field investigator notes potential serious noncompliance issues during an inspection, what advice do you have for sites, and I'm losing the end of this, in handling such issues in real time?
Okay, yeah, that's a really, really good question too, because yes, the focus has been on what happens after the inspection, but the field investigator is going to be there for a couple of days and we'll be bringing these issues up hopefully during the daily discussion. So I would view this as an opportunity to correct the issue or at least start investigating and correcting the issue as soon as possible. So, oftentimes, but not always, the issues that are noted during the inspection sometimes are not put on the 483. If the study staff and the CI are taking sincere and prompt actions to correct and obviously eventually prevent such issues from reoccurring. Thank you.
Thank you. And while we're on the subject of 483s, maybe one more question for you on that topic. If the 483 is issued and the PI responds with a CAPA and plans for verification of effectiveness, but the CAPA will take 3 months to implement, hence no data is submitted with the response, is this okay?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. That's a fantastic question. That's actually not a problem at all. And quite honestly, we expect some elements of the CAPA to take longer in order for them to be appropriately implemented. So with these, we recommend having a plan to monitor the effectiveness of that specific element of the CAPA, and ideally having the implementation and the effectiveness results documented as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Emily, let's go back to you for a question. Slightly different topic. What challenges do you face when monitoring decentralized trials?
Thanks, Kim. So I'm going to assume this means the challenges FDA has in oversight. I will take the opportunity, though, since the question talks about monitoring decentralized trials, if we're thinking about sponsor monitoring, that we do have guidances out there about risk-based monitoring, and sometimes when we have trials with decentralized elements, certain monitoring techniques may be especially suitable, like centralized monitoring by a sponsor. But that's just an aside. I'll ask the question or answer the question in terms of FDA. So one important thing to keep in mind is that, this question says decentralized trials, but really what we have are trials with decentralized elements, and you can have a very vast range there, right? From something like having a participants, with a DHT, like a wearable that's just providing data, to something that's like a completely decentralized where everything's done through telehealth. And so really, we have to, when we are providing our oversight, really the first thing is understand how the trial is structured and what the data flow is in the trial so that we can make an assessment. So it's really important to have a very clear description of how what the decentralized elements are, how the data flows, and whatnot, so we can understand it before we even come in to evaluate it. It's important, I think, to make sure that if we're doing a clinical investigator inspection, that the records that from data that may have been collected in a decentralized manner is available at the site for FDA review. And I think part of what we'll be looking at, and maybe this is an opportunity, not a challenge, it's just I'll harken back to Cheryl's presentation from earlier today and the importance of quality by design and quality risk management. And when decentralized elements are used as part of a trial, really thinking through like what are the risks to the data and how are they going to be accounted for, because those are going to be, if it's primary efficacy endpoint or important safety information, those are going to be things that we're going to be wanting to verify and look at on inspection, whether the data were collected on site or in a decentralized manner. So having really good risk management in place is going to make any challenges of FDA oversight, I think, lessened to some extent. So hopefully that helps. Thanks for that. Very good question.
Yes, thank you. And one more question about oversight. You spoke about alternative methods FDA uses for oversight. Are these methods available for sponsor monitoring of investigator sites? And can sites limit monitoring to particular methods?
Yeah, so this is a good question. You know, we don't dictate sort of the sponsors have a responsibility for monitoring, and they are supposed to use, you know, the quality by design and quality risk management to determine what monitoring would be appropriate for a particular trial when they are contracting with and you know, working with sites during startup. The methods of monitoring that they intend to use should be clear to those sites, and you know, it should be part of those discussions. FDA is not going to dictate that, but it should be clear to everybody. I know there have been a lot of questions about, you know, what sites can say, and we, you know, that's really between the site and the sponsor, and we would encourage those discussions so everybody's on the same page about what's going to happen. And then I'll just say, you know, in terms of alternative methods, you know, I think the answer I gave before about sort of risk-based monitoring and looking at sort of what's going to be most appropriate for the trial. Sponsors like FDA have a whole bunch of tools in their toolbox, and depending on the trial design and the risks and other considerations, they can choose a method that is, you know, the best fit for that trial, and it may give them some flexibility depending on the specific design. So I hope that helps. Thanks, Kim.
Great, thank you. And I think that actually closes out our Q&A session. So thank you once again to Cara, Emily, and Michelle, both for your presentations and willingness to engage the audience with questions. With that, I will turn it back over to Leonard Sachs for some closing thoughts. Leonard?
Well, thank you very much, Kim, and thanks to our speakers, Cara, Michelle, and Emily, for a great session. This brings us to the end of an intense 3 days focused on clinical investigators and clinical drug development. It's been a pleasure for us at FDA to have the opportunity to engage with you, and we very much hope that the material that you've heard from us will be useful to you. It remains for me to thank the many individuals who have given blood, sweat, and tears to the preparation of the content and responded to the questions. In particular, my thanks to Brenda Stoddart and the Small Business and Industry Assistance Program at FDA for all their tremendous help, to Jeff Kelly for his tireless technical support, my colleagues Millie Dougal and Kim Smith in my office for compiling the agenda and the content. Very grateful thanks to our terrific faculty for preparing their lectures, and a particular vote of thanks to our large and enthusiastic audience all over the world. We wish you all the best as you continue your critical work in clinical drug development, and we hope to see you back at our course next year. Thank you all.